This was supposed to be a minor procedural formality. Congresswoman Eleanor Vance, a seasoned civil rights attorney, had been scheduled for a brief court appearance in Austin Municipal Court. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe so you don't miss what they never expected to happen. The case? A parking citation and ironic ticket given to her car while she was meeting with affordable housing advocates about illegal evictions just blocks away. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she had no plans to challenge the ticket. She'd show up, pay the fine, and move on. Simple. Except that morning didn't go as planned. At exactly 8:52 a.m., Vance's legislative director in D.C. called her, breathless. The Department of Justice had just released preliminary findings on discriminatory eviction practices disproportionately targeting Latino families in South Austin. It was something Vance had been tracking for months, and the findings were crucial. The timing was politically sensitive. She needed to coordinate with both HUD and local city officials immediately. The call ran way too long. By the time Vance stepped into Courtroom 4A, it was 9:24 a.m., 24 minutes past her scheduled appearance. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe so you don't miss what they never expected to happen. She entered the courtroom with her signature poise, a charcoal suit, sensible heels clicking confidently against the polished floor. But the moment her presence was announced, the atmosphere shifted. Judge Samuel Caldwell, a white-haired figure with an air of undeserved authority, barely glanced up from the bench. "Congresswoman Vance," he drawled, sarcasm dripping from his voice, "how very gracious of you to join us this morning." Eleanor met his gaze with calm assertiveness. "My apologies for the delay, Your Honor. I was on an urgent call with the Department of Housing and Urban Development regarding matters directly affecting this district." Caldwell didn't wait for her to finish. "Save it," he snapped. "This is a courtroom, not Capitol Hill. You may be used to grandstanding in front of cameras, but here, you follow the rules." His voice grew harsher. "You're held in contempt." A murmur swept through the courtroom. "Contempt?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady. "For being 24 minutes late due to an emergency related to my congressional duties?" "For disrespecting this court," Caldwell barked. $75 fine, payable immediately." Vance raised an eyebrow but complied, pulling her phone from her purse to authorize the payment. The clerk took her card without looking her in the eye. It was small, the fine petty even, but it wasn't about the money. It was about the performance, the spectacle. Caldwell was making an example of her. She could have let it end there, but Eleanor Vance was not built for silence in the face of systemic disrespect. "In fact, Your Honor," she said after the fine was recorded, "I'm compelled to ask, would this courtroom have reacted with the same level of hostility if I were a white male attorney arriving late under similar circumstances?" The room stiffened. Caldwell leaned forward. "Watch your tone, Ms. Vance. I'm asking a question relevant to equal treatment under the law," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe so you don't miss what they never expected to happen." Caldwell sneered. "I'm not here for your political theater. You're skating close to another contempt charge," he warned. But Eleanor didn't back down. Her eyes narrowed. She took a step forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "With all due respect, Your Honor, it's not political theater to question whether bias is at play in a courtroom. It's a civic responsibility, especially for someone sworn to uphold the Constitution." The gavel struck the bench. "That's enough." But Eleanor didn't back down. "Your Honor, you just held me in contempt for a delay related to my work as an elected official serving the very community this court presumes to protect. Meanwhile, I've seen white attorneys stroll in late here without consequence. I have receipts. I have dates, and I have witnesses." Caldwell glared at her, his jaw tight. Someone in the courtroom gasped. From the back row, a reporter from the Austin American-Statesman began typing quietly on their phone. The tension was thick. "Either I'm wrong, and this court applies its rules fairly across the board," Eleanor continued, "or I'm right, and this moment, this exact moment, deserves the scrutiny of the Judicial Conduct Review Board." The silence in the room was deafening. The weight of decades of systemic bias, the arrogance of unchecked authority, and the power of someone unafraid to challenge it hung in the air. The courtroom remained frozen. Eleanor's challenge had created a rupture, and Judge Caldwell seemed to be grappling with just how far he was willing to let it spiral. His gaze darted between her and the packed gallery, and for the first time, the room felt like it was no longer under his control. He could have ended it then, could have dismissed her challenge as a nuisance. But something had changed. Eleanor wasn't just another politician looking for a fight. She wasn't someone afraid to challenge authority when the truth demanded it. "I move for recusal," Eleanor said, her voice firm. A stunned pause followed. Caldwell scoffed, smirking. Denied. But Eleanor had already planted the seed. I move for your recusal from this case on grounds of demonstrated bias and retaliatory conduct. Caldwell leaned back slowly in his chair, theatrically. You believe I'm retaliating against you over a parking citation, Congresswoman? I believe you used your authority to publicly reprimand and fine me not for my conduct. Eleanor replied. But for who I am, what I represent, and the fact that I had the audacity to speak when you expected submission. Gasps echoed from the gallery. A young Latino man sitting near the back muttered, "Wow," under his breath. Caldwell slammed his gavel harder this time. Enough grandstanding. You've made your little statement. Now either conclude your business with this court, or I will have you escorted out. Eleanor didn't flinch. If I'm to be removed, let the record show it's for questioning racial bias in a public courtroom. A murmur of support rippled through the gallery. Reporters were recording on their phones despite the posted signs forbidding it. The clerk glanced nervously at Caldwell, who seemed visibly unsettled by the shifting momentum in the room. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe so you don't miss what they never expected to happen. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor noticed two assistant district attorneys leaning in toward one another, whispering. One of them, a black woman named Lena Jackson, didn't look away when Eleanor's eyes met hers. There was a flicker of solidarity there, silent but undeniable. Caldwell finally exhaled, his demeanor shifting as he tried to bring the temperature of the room back under control. Ms. Vance, you may be an elected official, but in this courtroom, you are a defendant. I will not indulge this circus. Now sit down and allow me to finalize your citation. But Eleanor didn't sit. Instead, she stepped closer to the bar, separating the audience from the attorney's floor. Let the court take judicial notice, she said clearly, that the Honorable Judge Samuel Caldwell has issued a contempt charge for tardiness caused by a legitimate governmental emergency, refused to address potential racial disparities in courtroom treatment, and denied a recusal request without hearing arguments or considering a written motion. Caldwell was visibly boiling now, his hands clenching the bench. I don't care what office you hold, he growled. You are not entitled to lecture this court. Eleanor cut in. Try it, Your Honor. Try removing a sitting U.S. representative from a courtroom because she refused to be disrespected by a man who should have retired when dial-up internet was still a thing. A few snorts of laughter slipped through the tension. Caldwell slammed his gavel again. You are dangerously close to criminal contempt. And you're dangerously close to a federal ethics complaint, Eleanor said coolly. Your call. The bailiff hesitated, clearly unsure of how to act. Caldwell barked. Well, remove her. But the bailiff didn't move. Instead, the door at the back of the courtroom opened, and in stepped two new figures, representatives from the Judicial Oversight Commission. Word had traveled fast. They were supposed to be there next week for a scheduled review of procedural fairness, but someone had tipped them off early. Eleanor knew exactly who it was. From the gallery, Lena Jackson stood up. Your Honor, she called out calmly. As an officer of the court, I'd like to request a brief recess in light of emerging concerns about judicial conduct. This courtroom may be under review sooner than expected. Caldwell whipped his head toward her. Out of order, Ms. Jackson. No, sir, she replied evenly. You are. Gasps filled the room. The momentum had shifted completely. Caldwell looked like he had swallowed glass. He reached for his gavel but stopped short of slamming it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the Judicial Oversight Commission members who were already taking notes. The judge had lost the room. Standing, Eleanor turned slowly toward the gallery. Her voice dropped just enough to be intimate, just enough to cut deep. This isn't about a parking ticket. It never was. It's about power and how it's used when no one thinks anyone's watching. But now, people are watching. The reporters had already started tweeting. Vance confronts courtroom bias head-on, sparks fly. The story was starting to take on a life of its own. Eleanor wasn't playing to cameras, though. She was playing for the people who had come to court expecting injustice and gotten it. It's about starting a conversation this city and this country have been too afraid to finish, she continued. Equal protection under the law doesn't mean equal words in a statute. It means equal treatment in rooms like the one I stood in this morning. With those words, she turned and walked off the courthouse steps like Moses parting the Red Sea. By mid-afternoon, the video of the courtroom clash had gone viral. Major networks ran the footage on a loop. CNN picked up the feed within hours. Hashtags like Vance versus Caldwell and courtroom bias trended across platforms. What started as a minor citation had grown into a full-blown reckoning. Civil rights organizations began issuing public statements. The ACLU of Texas called for an investigation into Judge Caldwell's judicial history. Local activists released affidavits from past defendants, Black and Latino residents who had been treated unfairly, subjected to excessive fines and arbitrary contempt charges. But not everyone was on Eleanor's side. The Travis County Bar Association issued a cautious statement warning against the politicization of courtroom decorum. Conservative pundits accused her of weaponizing race to avoid responsibility. One anchor on a far-right network sneered, "If she can't handle being told to follow the rules, maybe she's not fit for public office." But Eleanor didn't flinch. She was built for this. That evening, she convened a press briefing at her district office. The cameras rolled as she stood before a wall of community members, past defendants, local attorneys, activists, and clergy. There wasn't a single empty chair. "I'm not asking for sympathy," she said. "I'm demanding accountability." From the back of the room, someone shouted, "You've got it." Applause erupted, not for a show, but for a shared reality. But behind the scenes, tension mounted. Eleanor's chief of staff warned her that backlash was growing. Anonymous threats had begun to trickle in. Social media trolls flooded her mentions. A mysterious envelope had arrived at her D.C. office, empty except for one typed line. "You should have stayed in your lane." Eleanor read it once and dropped it into a file marked Security Review. By the next morning, the story had gone national. A New York Times op-ed titled "The Courtroom Clash That Could Change Everything" ran with a sharp lead. What started as a $75 fine may cost Judge Caldwell his robe. But the judge remained silent, no interviews, no statements. However, behind closed doors, things were shifting. Sources within the courthouse began leaking internal memos, whispered accounts of past complaints against Caldwell, dozens of them, all dismissed or ignored. A pattern emerged. He had consistently imposed harsher penalties on defendants of color, interrupted them more, fined them more, silenced them more. Finally, the curtain was being pulled back. An emergency meeting of the Judicial Oversight Commission was scheduled for Friday. Rumors swirled that Judge Caldwell had retained legal counsel. Meanwhile, Eleanor wasn't slowing down. She launched a task force, partnering with civil rights lawyers and policy advocates to draft legislation for mandatory bias training for municipal judges, community-led courtroom observation programs, and new oversight bodies. The days following the courtroom clash were a whirlwind of media appearances, legal consultations, and growing public support for Congresswoman Eleanor Vance. News outlets from all across the nation continued to amplify the tension between her and Judge Caldwell, turning what had begun as a small confrontation into a larger conversation about racial justice, bias in the courtroom, and the abuse of power. By Thursday morning, the Judicial Oversight Commission held a highly anticipated emergency meeting. The entire city had been watching, and it wasn't just about Judge Caldwell anymore. It was about the broader systemic issues he represented. The commission had received more than 100 complaints and public testimonies, many from individuals who had been subjected to harsh, unequal treatment in his courtroom. The tension in the air was palpable as the commission deliberated in a packed conference room, with Vance's legal team present to argue for a full investigation into Caldwell's conduct. Judge Caldwell himself was absent, his lawyers standing in for him. Word had spread that Caldwell had already sought legal counsel, and there were rumors swirling that he might resign or face removal. Still, his defiant absence was a bold statement, one that implied he believed he could withstand the storm. But the storm was gaining force. Eleanor Vance stood just outside the commission's hearing room, preparing for her moment. The press had gathered outside in full force, cameras flashing as she emerged. Her resolve had only strengthened in the days since the courtroom confrontation. What had started as a fight over a petty parking citation had grown into a battle for accountability and fairness, one that resonated with people of all backgrounds, but especially the Black and Latino communities in Austin who had long suffered under the invisible yet powerful weight of racial bias in the justice system. A reporter from the Austin American-Statesman caught up with her as she approached the podium for her statement. "Congresswoman Vance," the reporter asked, "do you think Judge Caldwell will be removed from the bench?" Eleanor paused, allowing a beat for the question to sink in. She wasn't sure how this would play out, but she knew one thing for certain. She had already won the first battle. The conversation about judicial bias and accountability had begun. "Judge Caldwell's fate isn't just about him," she responded. "It's about the thousands of everyday people who walk into courtrooms across this city and this country, people who are dismissed, ignored, and treated with disdain simply because of who they are. Today, I'm standing here because that kind of injustice cannot be tolerated. No one is above the law, not even judges." Her words resonated with the crowd, her resolve inspiring the room. It wasn't just a call for the removal of one biased judge. It was a clarion call for a shift in how courts treated the marginalized, how racial disparities were acknowledged, and how institutions could be held accountable for the harms they perpetuated. Eleanor's legal team delivered their formal argument before the commission, presenting the evidence of Caldwell's history of discriminatory practices and the complaints from those who had suffered under his rulings. Witnesses were brought forward to testify, some even describing how Caldwell had deliberately ignored their pleas for leniency, dismissed their stories, and handed down harsher sentences than he would have for white defendants. It was clear that Caldwell had created a pattern of bias that had persisted unchecked for years. By the end of the day, the commission made its decision. Judge Samuel Caldwell would be temporarily suspended pending further investigation. The commission's ruling set a precedent for other judges in the state to be held accountable for discriminatory practices. It was a victory not just for Eleanor, but for the countless people who had been waiting for a moment like this, a moment when their voices were heard and their experiences acknowledged. The next morning, a statement from Judge Caldwell's office confirmed that he had decided to step down from his position on the bench, citing personal reasons. His resignation was seen as an admission of guilt by many. Some speculated that he had been given an ultimatum: resign now or face a lengthy investigation and potential removal. Either way, the decision was a watershed moment. The aftermath of the courtroom confrontation carried ripple effects beyond Austin. Eleanor Vance's name was now synonymous with the fight against judicial bias and racial injustice. Activists around the country praised her for her courage in challenging a powerful figure and demanding systemic change. Her inbox was flooded with messages of support and thanks, but there was also criticism, especially from conservative circles who accused her of grandstanding and politicizing the issue. But Eleanor Vance was undeterred. For her, this wasn't about personal recognition. It was about shifting the conversation and effecting real change. In the following weeks, Eleanor worked closely with civil rights groups, legal advocates, and lawmakers to introduce new legislation aimed at increasing transparency in the judicial system. The proposed bill would create mechanisms for regular reviews of judges' rulings, introduce mandatory bias training for court staff, and establish independent bodies to review complaints about judicial misconduct. It was a bold step forward, but one that had gained significant traction thanks to the spotlight she had cast on the issue. Meanwhile, the fallout from the case continued to echo through the halls of power. Calls for reform grew louder, and more people were demanding that their elected officials address racial disparities in the justice system head-on. The public pressure was undeniable, and Eleanor knew this was just the beginning. She had started something bigger than herself, a movement, a moment of reckoning for a system that had long favored the powerful over the vulnerable. As the sun set on another busy day in Washington, Eleanor Vance stood by her office window, reflecting on everything that had transpired. The road ahead would be long, and the battles would continue, but in that moment, she allowed herself a brief pause of satisfaction. She had not only held a judge accountable, she had begun a larger conversation, a fight for fairness, and a call for justice that could no longer be ignored. And in that fight, she would not back down. The courtroom may have been where this all started, but the battle for justice would carry on in every corner of the country for as long as it took to ensure that no one, no matter their race, their background, or their status, was treated as less than equal under the law. If you like this video, then subscribe to this channel. Also like this video. Then subscribe to this channel.